Good evening. My name is Paul Meck. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Association for Middle Level Education. Thank you for joining us and preparing to participate in this event. In respect for our presenters and all other participants, please make sure your personal microphone is in the muted position. To ask a question, use the chat feature located on your screen. You may direct your question to a specific panelist if desired. In the time available, as many questions as possible will be answered. The Pennsylvania Association for Middle Level Education is pleased to present the first in a series of educational webinars and conversations on highly relevant topics. This evening's conversation will focus on a most important topic: creating connections with kids. Our guest speakers this evening include Patti Kinney, an award-winning middle-level educator, consultant, speaker, and author, as well as past president of AMLE. Dr. Judy Brough, an internationally renowned middle-level consultant and recipient of AMLE's prestigious John Lounsbury Award. And Julie Cook, a teacher at Souderton Charter School Collaborative in Souderton, Pennsylvania. Souderton Charter School Collaborative is a Pennsylvania Schools to Watch school, and Julie is an expert at creating and sustaining connections with kids. And now for our webinar and our moderator, a person who's well known in AMLE circles for her leadership skills, Gail Heinemeyer.
Thank you, Paul, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our first webinar. Let me explain what our objectives for this session are tonight. One, we'd like to talk about the beliefs that were developed by the founders of the middle level movement, including the need for strong relationships. We want to look at what is the importance of building those strong relationships between students and teachers, and share some strategies that will allow you to develop and foster those relationships in your schools. So with that being said, at this point, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Judy Brough for some background on the founders of middle level movement.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to start by reading a quote from Walt Whitman, since I'm an old English teacher. What is the present, after all, but a growth out of the past? So here's a list that you can see of the founders of middle level school programs. I was fortunate enough to get to work and study with all of them. And it's interesting to note that when they started, it was in the late 50s, early 60s, and into the 70s that they built the components of a middle level school and what the essential elements were. At the time that the middle level movement started, there was a lot of unrest in society. We had the civil rights movement. We had a lot of violence that went along with that, especially if you look at what happened to our wonderful, great, late John Lewis. We also had the Kennedy assassination. We had the Vietnam War and the protests there. So there was social strife, which helped to cause some meaningful change. So these men that are listed on the slide were actually, they got together, they were tasked by the National Middle School Association in 1981 to write a book, a little pamphlet, which was called This We Believe. And I was, at the time, a graduate student of Conrad Tepfer's, so I was tasked with doing some of the groundwork, grunt work, and research for that monograph. And what it gave us was a research base for why we put into middle schools what we think ought to be in effective middle schools. The next slide shows you one of the pieces of research that I'm sure you've all seen and are very familiar with. That's Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. Tonight we're talking about making connections with kids, And if you'll look under the love and belonging, you'll see there it calls for friendship, family, intimacy, and a sense of connection. So today we're going to address how we go about making those connections with kids, not only between the teacher and the student, but the students along with other students. In that way, we help the kids to belong. They want to know that they belong in the school. And John Lounsbury, who I think is really the father of middle-level schools, although some would argue it's William Alexander, actually said, and I have a quote of his on the next slide, that their feelings, their self-esteem is all just as important than their cognition at this point, that the kids, in order to achieve, must actually feel like someone cares about them. So these middle-level icons actually wrote into this, we believe, how important it was for every child to have an adult advocate in the school. And it had to be more than the counselor, because the teachers get to know the kids on such a close basis that really they're the ones who are the cornerstone for building these relationships. And I like to call it school as family, that the kids feel like they're protected, respected, and people want them to be there. So with that, knowing that there is a research base to these relationships, I'm going to turn it over to Patti Kinney, who has written an excellent book about this very topic. Patti?
Okay, I think, what's the next slide, John? I can't, I'm not sure who put this one in. So does somebody want to talk about this one, or we'll come back to it?
Yeah, I think that's just suggestions for how to create some of those relationships.
Okay.
That's for reference.
All right. So skip ahead. There we go. So those are a couple books that I've been involved with. The one I'm going to talk a little bit about is the one on the left, Middle School, A Place to Belong and Become. My co-author, Lori Barron, who is a former middle school principal and currently a superintendent in a K-8 district in Montana. And I started talking about what was important at the middle level. So next slide. I'm a real quote person. And I love this quote. I think James Comer is from Yale, I believe so. No significant learning occurs without a significant relationship. I think that was the mantra when I was a school principal that I tried to enforce with my teachers to get them to understand. If you think back to the teachers that you had as a student, I don't always remember the math that I learned in Mr. Johnson's math class. I know I'd learned because I eventually went on to upper division math, but I remember Mr. Johnson, and I remember the connections he had with those of us in his class, and that he cared about us. Next slide. When Lori and I were talking about putting together a book about middle level, which we're both passionate about, we started examining the research. Judith brought up about this, we believe. There's been a couple other iterations and updatings of that particular document with the Middle School Association. The Principals Association puts out Breaking Ranks, and it has information on middle school. The National Forum for Middle School Schools to Watch has things. And when you look at all the research, and when you look at everything we know about what makes a quality middle school, we feel that belonging and becoming is the lowest common denominator. Kids need that connection. They need that place where they feel where they belong, that they are safe, that they are respected, their voice is heard, they're valued. And they also need a place where they feel they can explore, they can learn, and they can discover who they are becoming. And that's really critical at this age. Next slide. Another quote that I love is this one. I will say good afternoon because I'm really on the West Coast where I live, and it's only a little after 4 o'clock here. So I didn't grow up with lobsters, and I mean, we have crabs on the coast, but I didn't realize until I was in Maine visiting some friends once that lobsters shed their skin, that they need to shed their skin so they can grow. And I realized how much that serves as an analogy for our middle school students. They're vulnerable, they're shedding their childhood and they're growing into young adolescence. They're becoming the people that they want to become. And it's a scary time for them. And we have to create that environment for them that lets them feel safe and it lets them feel that they are growing, and it's a place where they can come, where it's those connections are so important to adults, and to connections between kids is also critical. I brought home, after that trip to Maine, I brought home to my staff little tiny rubber lobsters and told them to put it on their desk where they could see them, and it would remind them that we needed to create that environment and to build those connections. And one of my 6th grade teachers came up to me a few weeks later and said she had a student that came up to her and said, "What is it with all these little rubber lobsters that I see on teachers' desks?" And always looking for a teachable moment, she said, "Well, Mrs. Kinney was in Maine and she thought this was a good analogy for middle school students." And the middle school students asked her, "Well, what does she mean?" And she said, "Well, what do you think she might mean?" And the student said, "Well, does she think we're all crabby?" So, you know, building those connections where you have opportunities to talk with kids is critical. If you'll look at the next slide, we talk a little bit about some of the things you can do to create that culture, that you can build those connections. One of the ones I'll touch on briefly is believe in students. What do you do to show your students that you believe in them? I was interviewing a group of 7th graders at a middle school in Texas at one time, and I asked them what was the most important thing about their school. And this one little girl looked at me and she says, "Our teachers believe in us. They trust us and they give us that belief and that trust. If we screw up, we may lose it and we have to earn it back, but we don't have to earn it in the first place." Those teachers really worked on building those connections with kids. And again, because I'm a quote person, I'll end with this last quote that I think is so important. It was actually written by a couple of people talking about a home, but I think it fits for a school. "All people need a place where their roots can grow deep and they always feel like they belong and have a loving refuge." Do you have the connections with your students that make that your classroom, your school? And all people need a place that gives wings to their dreams, nurturing possibilities of who they might become. So building those connections and developing those relationships with students is absolutely critical to their learning and to their future success as an adult. I'll turn it back over to Gail.
Okay, thank you. And you see some references there. And again, this will be recorded and you'll be able to access this. How about, Julie, do you have any insights that you would share from your perspective as a current classroom practitioner about creating those connections with your kids?
Well, I think this is the first order of business for every September, but this year there certainly is a sense of urgency to reconnect with our students. And as Judy and Patti just highlighted for us, for middle schoolers, as we all know, socialization and connectedness is like drinking water. They really need to feel a sense of belonging in order to learn. So I think the students, first off, will take a cue from us. So here we are living in these historic times, and the spirit of the place when we come back can be, we're in this together. This too shall pass. This is going to be an amazing year. So if we set that tone, I think that's one thing that we can do. In our school, every August, every student has an individual learning plan meeting with teachers, families, and students. And this year, of course, it will be virtual, but it's a chance to set goals for the year, meet with the families and the students, and it really underscores that the school year will be about an individualized approach, and that we care about each child as an individual. Throughout the year, of course, we work hard to build those relationships that you were talking about, formally in advisory sessions and the like, and informally throughout the day. ordinarily, the kinds of experiences that a lot of schools start their school years off with, like camping trips, in our case, also build a sense of community. So we'll be looking to mirror that kind of community building activity in different ways. The first week of school, I will tell you that we are going to be working to build a culture. We're going to write some tenets together that we all want to live up to. We'll start with some cooperative games that are tied to our tenets. If it's virtual or even if it's 6 feet apart, we'll need to adapt, but it's still our first priority. So yes, I think students will be behind academically, but we'll get them there faster if we start with community building. Because everything is so uncertain, I think we're going to need to focus on essentials as we launch our new school year here. Priority 1 in September will be making those connections with kids, building a positive team and school culture and identity that can support resilience, which I think we're all going to need throughout this year. This will be followed closely. Our team decided over the past weeks of planning that we will need to explicitly teach the skills the kids will need to know to navigate our new normal. And I just wanted to add too, when you talk about community building, I think it will be important to keep the adults in the building in mind. This is not easy this summer. I think most schools are working around the clock to try to pull this off. So middle school should serve as an example to all schools with the teaming concept. So we're lucky to have a team support.
Okay, great. Thanks, Julie. One of the things I'd like our participants to know is this is designed to be an interactive webinar. And Paul mentioned the chat box. If you've got some questions, we hope that you will enter them into that chat box because we want to take advantage of the expertise that our panelists have to share with you some specific ideas. So please, those of you that are out there listening, don't be afraid to enter some information there in that chat box and pose some questions. What I'd like to do now is start with a question and just kind of go around the horn and ask each of you to kind of chime in on something that you might suggest to help us with this. But Julie just mentioned the idea of building a sense of community. And that extends to not only your students, but the families, the caregivers, the people that are working with them on a regular basis, perhaps at home. Can each of you provide a specific structure or strategy that you would employ to be able to create that sense of community?
Well, I can start. So I think student-centered learning is a focus in our school. And even in a remote learning situation, I think that that is a great starting point as a mindset, that this is really about you. It's not about the pages of the textbook driving the curriculum. It's about student voice and choice. In our school, one thing that we do, which I think is fantastic, is we have a program called iSearch, which is a year-long independent study where students can choose any topic that they'd like and set out to master it in 1 year. It could be anything from butterfly gardening to architecture. It's a serious research project, but it involves field work. This year that will look virtual, and interviews and a 45-minute presentation to the whole school community at the end. So my point in sharing that one example is that if we believe that school is about finding your passion and your talent and what makes you feel alive and engaged, well, school is exactly the place for this kind of a deep dive. So thinking about ways that you can invite students into the curriculum. So when you say, you know, what do you know, what do you want to know, and what have you learned, KWL, that what do you want to know is not an academic exercise. Let's go, like, let's lead with that. Let's find that student interest and actually tie that to part of our investigations throughout the year. When I think about knowing students well, I think it also means getting to know them academically and understanding where the student is and understanding that with every interaction we have, we are really building a sense of him or herself as someone who can or cannot do math, read well, present well, understand how to apply an art concept or whatever. And so for this reason, I think building the connections with kids means entering into a kind of agreement right off the bat. So I will do away with the idea and the actions that make you feel like a remedial student, which has really been proven in my mind to be a failed model. I see you as a capable student, and I'm willing to support you until you believe it too. In return, I'm expecting your engagement. So I don't think this is going to change in a remote or physically distant environment. If we start with what we know to be true about what's essential, right, as I said before, about what kids at this age need, this can shape the decisions we are making about the fall right now, no matter what school looks like. So it's not, again, about packets and textbooks. We can make decisions that include synchronous meetings. Breakout spaces must be included in the planning. Time for advisory, time for creative expression, time for socialization. Those are not extras.
Great. And Patti, one of the things that you mentioned was the idea of being able to give voice to students, which certainly helps them to feel a part of the community. Do you have a specific suggestion or strategy that you could share that is a good way to do that?
I think you have to look for ways to give students authentic voice in the school. I'll give you an example from my school that would be a little harder in a remote situation, but we had some opportunity with a school district bond to, our elementary schools were building playground structures. And I had quite a bit of pushback when I suggested that we needed something like that on our middle school campus, because we have kids of all ages, all abilities, and they needed some place like that during our break times to go out and play. And finally, the superintendent was on my side, and the board finally saw the light. And so we started developing it, and I brought kids in, brought 8th graders in, and had them work with the person that was building it. They shared ideas, they came up with a plan, they put it together, and it became a structure that I think the following year when it was up, my dean of students looked at it and it said it was like ants on taro, with the kids just rushing out during lunchtime and climbing all over this. Another example involved in the curriculum that give kids an opportunity to have a voice was my health teachers were working on a unit, and it was talking about secondhand smoke, and the kids became very passionate about people smoking on school grounds. Today that isn't an issue, it's prohibited, but back then we had people who were smoking at football games behind the kids, and different things like that. And they put together a program, took it to our school board and presented it. And the school board adopted a policy that prohibited at elementary, middle school, and high school level of smoking on school grounds in any situation. And there was some pushback, but kids were able to see that they had a voice, that it made a difference, that if they shared their thoughts, they did it in an appropriate way, and they'd had the research to back them up on what they were asking for, it was working.
Perfect. And one of the questions that has come in from one of our participants asks, could you give some family building ideas for schools that don't have true teaming? And actually, I think both of the examples that you've mentioned kind of do fit that. Those were done irrespective of teaming. Those were ways that you did create a sense of community among those students with their voice. But anything else that you could share about?
Yes, I can share something with this. True teaming really shouldn't get in the way of developing those relationships. We do want to have every kid have at least one adult advocate. And I found that there were always kids that who I could relate to better than other people who were teaching those kids. And sometimes I had to say to another teacher, I'm having a hard time relating to this child. How are you dealing with them? So I think sometimes we have to see that our personalities sometimes clash or sometimes mesh. I was always much better with the kids who were considered to be at risk. And so those are the kids who I really got to know. And I would start out right at the beginning because we want to establish that family bond, it's not just us with the kids, it's the kids with the other kids as well. So one of the things that I did, I even did this with college students, on the very first day, I would say, all right, I'm going to tell you something about me. And I might say something like, I really like vacationing in Maine. And the reason that I like vacationing in Maine is because I like the weather, I like lobster, and it makes me happy because I like being out in nature. Can anybody else relate to anything that I just said? And somebody might say, oh my gosh, I can't stand lobster. My mother loves lobster. She brings it in. But let me tell you what I like. And so what we try to do is get kids to relate to other kids, and to get to know each other a little bit better right from the beginning. I'll never forget one little girl, Sarah, the very first day said, well, I think probably the most interesting thing about me is because, you know, Nancy over there said that she has a sister who she really kind of likes. She said, I'm a quadruplet. And so there are 4 of us who are the same age and we all have to share a room. And my mother said the most difficult thing was trying to figure out what to name us so that she wouldn't get confused. So she decided that since I'm Sarah, nobody else could have a name that began with S. And she said, and my mother mixes us up anyway. So just those kind of, let's get to know each other right from the beginning and get to know their names right from the beginning as well. Nothing says you don't belong as, hey, you know, rather than, you know, oh, I can't remember your name, you know, tell me one more time what it is. I would take a picture of my kids on the very first day, and you can do that in a Zoom setting too. Just take a picture and write down the names so that you know them right away, and then make a game out of it with the kids. All right, now I can name everybody here in Zoom, you know, now who else can do it? So you get to know each other, because I want to make a safe environment. So it's a shame you don't have true teaming, Heather. You could probably start inching people into that, which I found many schools do. We get teachers who are excited about doing some of these middle school things with kids, and it works. And success breeds success. So maybe if you don't have a 4-teacher team, can you find another soul who you would want to work with you? Because just because you're not called a team doesn't mean you can't act like one. And in my mind, 2 people can make a team.
And I have 2
Gail,
quick
can I
questions.
throw in an idea that something that Judith said reminded me of this? One thing we did in my school to make sure that kids were connected is sometime in the middle of the year, I put up a list of all the students in the staff room. And we had about 650, 700 middle school students. And I asked all of my staff, not just my teachers, my custodians, my secretaries, everybody, to put a star by the people's names, the kids' names that they knew on an exceptionally good relationship. They were really connected with. They could tell you about these kids talked to them on a regular basis. Put a check mark by students that they knew pretty well, that they could approach. They knew some of the things about them, that they felt they had some sort of a connection with them. And we did that for about 5 days, and then we looked at the list. And what we discovered was we had a big cluster of kids, of our top kids, the kids who everybody knew, who did well in school. And we had a big cluster of kids who were struggling because everybody was trying to help them out. But we did have kids in the middle that nobody really knew very well. And so we took those kids that didn't have any stars or checks and asked kids, everybody in the school to take, you know, a small number. I don't remember how many there was. I know I took a couple of kids myself as principal of the kids. I see these kids at lunch every day. I will make sure that I was out reaching out to build a relationship with those kids. And that really helped keeping kids from falling through the cracks.
You know, and that's a really important observation that you made, and I hope people picked up on that, that she did not just do that with the teachers.
Mhm.
The custodial staff was involved, the food service staff. That again helps to create that sense of community within your school, and you never know who might be the person that does have that good connection with the kid. So that's a great way to really build community across the school.
Our high school did something at graduation that speaks to that. And that was every senior as they graduated could invite the staff member of their choice to introduce them at graduation. And it was the staff member. We had kindergarten teachers, we had coaches, we had custodians, we had lots of middle school teachers, high school teachers. Some people only had one child they introduced, others introduced a whole row, but it was so cool to see those connections that the child, the graduating senior could pick from who made the difference in their life.
And that's a great way to really extend that notion of community. Two quick questions, and then I'll get into one that's a little bit more difficult. And John Walsh, could you go to the slide that showed the Maslow hierarchy of needs? I think that's the diagram that somebody is requesting to take a look at. And Julie, there was a question about your iSearch project. Is that done independently, or do students work with a partner or a group to complete that?
We have lots of different group projects, but that's an independent project that the student becomes the expert throughout the year. As I said, it's a pretty serious research project too. It's how we build our library skills, which are still important. Power School's a thing. All libraries have fantastic online resources. It's how we build interviewing skills, presentation skills, how to take notes. All of those other skills are in there. We support each child with their project. So as we've done this over the decades now, we know a bagpiper, we know a metal worker, we know a woodworker, we know all these different kinds of people that might help support the student in this. But we do have other opportunities. A lot of schools have genius hours. We call it independent study, where they can actually either work independently or collaborate with others. But this is an independent project, yes. If you're interested, you're welcome to reach out to me. I'll definitely give anybody who would like my iSearch materials. I see that my teaching partner is also here. We will share.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question came in about how are you going to begin to build those connections with students if you happen to be in a situation where you are going to be starting the school year virtually and you have a significant number of your population that is not real comfortable using technology, even though technology has been applied or supplied for all of them. So anyone with suggestions as to how to work on getting people comfortable using the tech and creating those connections at the same time?
I can respond to our plans and how we handled it this spring. I think it's like anything, you know, kids who don't know, you teach them. So we will start off with some very simple lessons about how to access a lot of the cool tools that we do use. We're a whole Google school. We use that platform. So Google Classroom, really, it's how we teach them how to access the curriculum. So it's just going to be step by step. That's going to be some of our first unit has a lot of like easy plugins for how do we use Padlet, for example. It's a great collaboration space. It's sort of like a virtual bulletin board. Flipgrid is awesome. You can post short videos in response to a text or a current event post or something like that. And this is how we ran a remote poetry night in the spring for the entire school community. Hyperdocs really have helped us personalize and differentiate learning for kids. We start with a driving question and head to a launch party, and then we're off and running with some project-based learning that can happen. We're planning for this to be either hybrid or in person or virtual. And that's my advice to all teachers out there is plan once and have the access available any way you slice it. Gosh, there's also, book creator, which is exactly like it sounds. You can create a book online, but kids will need to know how to use Zoom, and small, short tutorials will go a long way for access, with opportunities to practice one thing at a time, scaffolding, just like we do with any good teaching, I think. I think that is going to be, as I said before, really alongside with making those connections with kids, really priority one. We don't know what the rest of the school year is going to look like. So if we do have them for even a few weeks in September or however long it is, we're really going to take advantage of that time to set the rest of the year up, no matter what it looks like, for success.
Perfect. One of the questions too that we wanted to consider is, as the year goes on, and it doesn't even have to be that long length of time, but say within the first 2 weeks, that you notice that you have students that are withdrawn, they're not engaged, they don't feel part of the school, they don't feel like they belong. What are some things that you can do to intervene with that one particular student?
I think when you notice that, you make a note of it yourself, and you do an intervention. And I'm going to give you an example. I had a young kid who we'll call Gary. He seemed very depressed. He did not engage at all. I had him when he was in 7th grade. He had repeated 2 grades in elementary school, so he was older, and kind of felt out of it as it was. And then, so I talked to him individually. Now, I could get near him, and part of his problem was that Gary smelled. And I took him aside and I said, Gary, are you taking like showers or baths regularly? And he said, yes. And I said, I think a problem that you may have is maybe your clothes are not as clean as they could be. And I said, do you have a washing machine at home? And he said, yes. And I said, well, who does the laundry? And he said, nobody. I said, all right, your homework assignment is to go home and draw a picture of all of the dials on your washing machine, and draw a picture of all the dials on your dryer. And then that evening, I bought some laundry detergent, and the next day, I had Gary meet me for lunch, and we sat down and went over how to work the washing machine. I said, you don't need anybody to do it for you. You can do it yourself. And he did. And he started coming in not smelling, and lo and behold, he started making some friends. Kids were staying away from him because he really did smell badly. So sometimes you have to have some uneasy conversations with kids on a one-on-one basis. Now, just because of the world we live in, when I had kids who would come in and have lunch with me, which I always did, I left the classroom door open. You don't want to be by yourself with a kid, but just having them in the room, having lunch together. We're a society where we share a lot when we're eating. I would bring in food for the kids because not all of the ones who I had money for lunch or would bring lunch. I had another kid named Jeff. Jeff was 16 years old when I had him in 7th grade, and he was the only kid in the middle school who applied for a parking place. And Jeff was quite large, and he didn't feel like he was a part of it. He wanted to be the first kid in his family to get through 8th grade. No one in his family had ever gotten through 8th grade. And so I noticed that Jeff was quite an awesome artist. And, I was making bulletin boards. I can't draw a snowman in a snowstorm. So I said to Jeff, come in, will you, over lunch, and will you help me design my bulletin boards? I was teaching science that year. I was elementary certified, so that means I could teach anything. And we were going over the parts of a flower and, you know, all kinds of botany kinds of things in life science in 7th grade. He made my bulletin boards for me. And as a result, he learned the material and he legitimately got a C in my class. He then started to feel like he was an able learner. And I had to explain to him, Jeff, you just have to learn in a different way. You're a visual learner, obviously. So the next thing we did is I said, what other subject are you having difficulty with? Social studies. All right, you come in at lunch, and what we're gonna do is we'll take what you're studying in social studies, and you're gonna start drawing those things. Rather than answering questions in words, let's draw it and see if you can remember it. I'm happy to say Jeff made it through 8th grade. He didn't make it through 9th, but he did make it through 8th grade. So I think, you know, talking with the kids one-on-one is so important. Think about your own family. Don't you do that with family members? And you have to do it. Caring is also having those difficult conversations, ones that we would rather not have, but you can't fix something if you don't know it's broken.
Absolutely. One of the things too that people have been questioning about is, are there tools or something that you can use to really kind of help you to know both your students and their families? And one of the things that has been in use for quite some time is the question to the parents about, tell me about your kid in 1,000,000 words or less.
Good.
Which is a wonderful way to gather information from a parent's perspective about their child. And they'll be happy to go on and on and on and on and on and share all kinds of information for you. Another thing you might consider is doing some inventories with your kids and asking them, you know, how do you learn math best? How do you study? What do you do? What are your favorite activities? And start to build a bank of things about each of those kids that you can make those connections. The school district where I worked adopted a uniform code of dress, which meant everybody either had to wear a green or a white shirt. But prior to that, one of the neat ways to make connections with kids was you saw them and they would have a shirt that, you know, had a team name or the name of a college or something, which was always a conversation starter. So looking for those ways, and you can still do that even if it is remotely. In fact, you have maybe more of a chance to do that. Observe what the kids look like when you're watching them online. What is their body language? Laurie DeSautels, who is a professor at Butler University and does a lot on neuroscience, talked to our group last week, and she said, there's an old African proverb that if you want to know which way the wind is blowing, look at the sand. If you want to know how a child is feeling, look at their body. And you'll kind of see that sense. Do they kind of look forlorn? Are they downcast? Are they not actively engaged? So look for those kinds of cues. And even if they're not there in person, 6 feet away from you, what do you see there on the screen? All right.
Gail, let me throw in an idea I saw used once to get to know kids that I thought, oh, this was really clever. And it was a teacher who, when she took roll, she took the time to call each child's name. But instead of them saying here or, you know, silence, they answered a question. So the question of the day might be, what's your favorite color? And so when she called their name, they would share that. What's your favorite food? She came up with all these questions that just could be answered in 2 or 3 words. She's taking roll. It kept the kids engaged, and it started letting kids know more about them, each other, and her to know more about them.
Sure, and that's a great technique, ways that the kids can open up. It's sort of a way that if you can adapt some form of a morning meeting or incorporate advisory, that you can begin those discussions by just throwing out a very non-threatening kinds of questions that doesn't have a right or wrong answer, but everybody, again, can respond to that and feel that they've got a voice.
That's interesting that you say that, Gail, because, you know, our forefathers in middle school really did advocate advisory programs, which ended up really not being very successful. But I think the reason was more because of mechanics than it was because of the idea behind advisory. You don't have to have a set advisory time to do advisory. If you see kids are having difficulty with something, then you know that if it's getting in the way of the learning, there's no point in ignoring the elephant in the room. You have to do something about it. So you have to give yourself permission to look at the group, like Gail just said, and say, okay, look, we're all concerned about X. I know that our kids who we're going to start meeting in a few weeks are going to be concerned about race relations. They're going to be concerned about a virus. They're going to be concerned about neighbors who are arguing over political differences. If we don't let the kids voice those and get them out, they're going to get in the way of their learning. So part of the advisory that our forefathers were advocating was getting kids to think about ethical choices. How do you treat people, even if you don't like them or if you disagree with them? Those are things that are life lessons that these guys wanted us to talk about. All of our forefathers were really part of the civil rights movement, even though they're all white. I mean, Conrad Tepfer was jailed at one point because of a protest that he was in. And they really believed that at middle school level, it was the time to get kids to think about those kinds of more lofty ideals. Because, as I said earlier, you want to build that family relationship among the kids as well as between you and them. So again, if you look at Maslow, under love and belonging, it's friendship, family, intimacy, and a sense of connection. So how do we go about building those friendships? Sometimes you can use kids, and I'm going to give you another example. I had a little girl named Angelica, and she was very, very shy. Nobody wanted to work with her in cooperative groups. And I had another girl named Audra, who was probably the most popular child I had ever had in my entire teaching career. And I took Audra aside and I just said, Audra, do you think you could bring Angelica into some of the group work that you're doing? Do you think maybe you could sit with her at lunch? I think she could really be a good friend to you, and you could certainly be a good friend to her. And Audra did. And so Angelica made a friend, and those kind of just little small links just add to the kids' self-esteem. And as I said at the beginning of this whole process that we're going through, the esteem and the feeling of comfort and the feeling of belonging has to come before we talk about the academics. So Gail has said on a number of occasions, it's Maslow before Bloom, right, Gail?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what we have to think about. And we have to give ourselves permission to do it. And I'm sorry that we've gotten to the point where, because politicians have gotten so involved, that it becomes about the test and taking the test. Well, the kids are not going to do well on the test if they're not paying attention anyway, right? So I told this group in one of our organizational meetings, unfortunately, one guy told me the high stakes testing, he said, I just don't like it. He said, high stakes are for tomatoes. He said, but I realized that what we have to do is get to these belonging, safety, security needs in order for the kids to feel like they can move on. And part of that is making sure they feel like able learners. And that's one of the reasons, Julie, why I really liked your example of those independent studies, because they're becoming an expert in something. And now when they're sharing it, how many of those kids had never thought of themselves as an expert in anything before? But if I can become an expert in something that I'm studying, Why can't I study something else and become an expert in something else? I actually watched a school, Dallastown, Pennsylvania, where they had talent day during middle level education week, where the kids could show their talents. And one of the best talents, and one of the talents that most of the kids rated as the best one, was a kid who was from a farm family, who was not very popular, but he had bred a blue chicken. And he brought the chicken into school. And as kids were sharing, you know, here's what I'm an expert in, this kid was saying, I know about genetics. I know I know about dominant traits and recessive traits and how you have to put them together. And I'm telling you, that chicken was blue. So just that idea that I'm helping you to enable yourself to think of yourself as a good learner. And it doesn't have to be in every subject, because as Julie said too, you start out small, right? You scaffold. You start with something regardless of what it is, and then you continue to add to it.
Yeah, if I could add a little bit about what our spring was like and maybe some tips that people can take with them or not. But we did conduct morning meetings remotely. We always have morning meetings. Our morning meetings are loosely based off of responsive classroom. For more on that, you can look at Teaching Tolerance. But even remotely, we started 8:30 every day with a synchronous meeting. This year, we're actually thinking of doubling down on morning meeting, which is also an advisory period, and ending our day with that as well. And we had advisory, really fun activities. We had open mic Mondays where kids could share their pets and a joke or a song or a talent that they had. We had some time to launch some independent investigations. We had a house hunt. Where's the water shut off? What's the energy bill look like? You know, that kind of thing, since they were home. We had sharing time for some of the service work projects that we were involved in, and writing, and some character building and health check-ins. It was a great way to come together and launch our day. And basically, we're doubling down on morning meeting and advisory time. I think also, if, you know, relentless engagement is what we call it in our program. If a kid starts to fall out, you know, we try to notice, first of all, right away. We send out in Google Classroom every day a how are you form. This is the easiest thing you can do, is just say, how are you? And then the kid can tell you or not, or just put a little smiley face and you're good to go. But sometimes kids will not tell you in person, but you know, you should check in with me later. That is fantastic. And then you can kind of, you know, work your magic as a teacher. This year too, at the end of the year, and we'll definitely keep doing this, we had Zoom meetings where we had office hours, where students were invited. And then if they didn't come, we'd call and say, hey, I asked you to come to the office hours. We missed you. Where were you? We also invited once a week. We had open office hours for families to stop by. Having that time where families can come and ask questions, or we can have short meeting times, go to a private Zoom chat breakout session with a teacher. That was really, really fantastic for building that home and school connection. So there's just a few quick ideas that we had for doing that remotely.
Great. We are rapidly coming to the end of our hour, but I'd like to go back through the group one more time and ask if you have some parting words of advice for our folks. So Patti, let us start with you.
One thing that I've
noticed on the spot, but
okay. One thing I noticed that's come up a couple of times is I don't have teams, or we've talked about advisories, or don't have those. Is I guess I give you a piece of advice to, if there are things that you're not seeing in your school, we don't have teaming, we don't have advisories, we don't have common planning time. Look at what are the outcomes and what are the reasons behind it, and are there other structures that'll get you there? In my school, because of a variety of reasons, we were never able to go to fully integrated teams. Kids were on 2 different teams, but yet it was working. And we had some things set up. So don't get hung up on the structures of middle schools and say, well, they're preventing, we don't have teams, we don't have advisory, so I can't build those connections with kids that I want to. look at the purpose behind those structures and what they're trying to do, and see what are other ways to do it. In other words, don't give up, build those connections.
Great. Julie, how about you? Any?
My parting thought would be just, spin it positive as always. These are challenging times. If we launch with a sense of possibility, we'll be ready for whatever hits us. The spring might have taken us by surprise, but this is an opportunity, I think, to reinvent what school could be. We're looking right now, all these conversations we're having about what does September look like? Well, it starts with building connections with kids. So how wonderful is that this is sort of a side door has allowed for what is essential in teaching and in learning. So this conversation and others that all schools across the country are having, I see it as a real opportunity. And hopefully my optimism will carry me through this school year.
How about you, Judy? Some final thoughts?
I think the optimism is absolutely essential. I think Patti is spot on, and John Lounsbury and Conrad Teffer would probably want to hug you for saying that it's not about the structure. They actually wrote a whole paper on that, which was never published, but I just read again yesterday, that you can't get bogged down in the structure. You have to look at what is the purpose. So the whole idea of what is the goal of what we're doing, and I'll put it together any way I can. And then to piggyback on what Julie said too, we have opportunities now. In every single social upheaval we've had, something good has come out of it. So rather than focusing on how difficult this is going to be, and it will be difficult, we have to focus on, well, what can I do now to make it even better than it was before? Because now maybe the high stakes tests aren't going to be rammed down your throats anymore. Maybe you can feel free to do some of the kinds of activities with the kids that you've always wanted to do. So give yourself permission to really look at Maslow and say, what am I doing to help our kids, each one of those kids? And I have to say, I told you that I had mostly at-risk kids. I have to tell you, I referred to them as kids at promise.
There you go. And one last thing that I would say, and I think this ties into what people have said, and kind of to keep that optimistic viewpoint, Arthur Ashe, famous tennis player, always said, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. So whatever you've got out there, that's your starting point. Do the best that you can with that. So I thank you. At this time, I'm going to turn this over to Bruce Fosberg.
Thank you. I'm the incoming president of PAMLE, and I want to thank you all for attending this first webinar of PAMLE. And I do want to remind you that we do have another one that's going to be featuring social emotional learning on Wednesday, September 9th. And I have listed on the sheet here the guest speakers which we have for that. It should be an interesting time, and we will have more information on our website at pamle.org. And I need to remind you all about the Act 48. If you're looking for Act 48, please don't forget to go to the website. You must fill out the evaluation form, and we would like everyone to do that because we would like to get feedback as we move forward with these different webinars. But you need to complete that evaluation form in order to get the Act 48, and it's all on the website at pamle.org. So again, I want to thank you all so much. I want to thank our panelists. Y'all did a great job, and hopefully y'all got something out of this. And thank you, and we hope to see you all again in September. Have a great start of the school year.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.